A panel of think tank scholars, policymakers, and business leaders will discuss how COVID has helped think tanks understand the value and importance of partnerships and to research across geographic and ideological boundaries to forge new and exciting partnerships. The panelists will provide examples of effective bilateral and multilateral institutional partnerships and joint research projects and programs. May I please welcome the following panelists to the stage, and as I say your name, please be seated right under your name. If you don't mind, let me start with Dilawar Ala Eddin from Iraqi Kurdistan. He's the President, Middle East Research Institute. Brian Finlay, the President, Stimson Center, United States of America. Dor Gold, President, Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs from Israel. Marlos Lima, Director of International Affairs from Brazil. Stormy Annika Mildner, the Executive Director, Aspen Institute, Germany. And ladies and gentlemen, this session is going to be moderated by the Chair, Akchai Maathur, Director and Head of Geoeconomic Studies Program, Observer Research Foundation from India. Go ahead. Mr. Akshay, I think we are a bit behind schedule. You have your, you'll have your time. You will have till 4:15. Brian Finlay? Is he online? Is Brian Finlay online? Yes, he's online. Yes. Waiting for you. Okay, thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Pleasure for me to be here, and we really appreciate the tribute that has just been given. And on behalf of Observer Research Foundation, I want to also just express deep condolences and our prayers to Jim McGann's family. He was very well known in India, and particularly to ORF. And we thank him for his friendship and his leadership over the years. And in the spirit of what he always wanted to do, I think this panel is particularly fitting because it talks about partnerships in a post-COVID world. The one thing that this crisis has taught us is that partnerships at global, local, regional levels is particularly important if we have to fight global battles. There are three, perhaps for the panelists, three issues and developments I would like to highlight as we get into this discussion. One, of course, is that the global challenges we are all very well familiar with, and I think increasingly we know that issues like climate change, the pandemic, terrorism, digital economy cannot be fought alone, so it requires partnerships. Second, of course, is that there have been lessons that I'm sure we've all learned over the course of 2 years, and the leadership here of think tanks, I'm particularly going to ask you if you can refer to some of those lessons that you have learned through the pandemic on how think tanks work and what kind of partnerships are really important. And third, I think that we are already seeing the governments collaborating across borders and businesses collaborating across borders. And think tanks have the imperative now to collaborate across borders, make sure that we are in step with the policy work that is going on. So it's a pleasure for me to welcome these leaders from different think tanks around the world. There are three questions I would like to pose to the panelists. One, how has the nature of cross-border partnerships between think tanks changed over the last 2 years or as a result of the pandemic? Second, what institutional hurdles remain and restrain think tanks from collaborating? Is it feasible for us to collaborate across borders, or are we really targeted and really focused towards the goals and the missions that we have within our borders? And third, what can think tanks do to collectively disseminate the research and collectively influence global policy making? So the format here is that each of you collectively have about 10 minutes. I would request you to give your opening statements, 5 to 7 minutes, and then hopefully I can come back to you with at least one round of questions, and there is a question and answer session for 30 minutes that's scheduled. So with that, Dilawar, may I request you first to do your opening statement?
Thank you, Akshay. Thank you very much to the organizers, Mr. Abdullah Al Khalifa and your team, excellent team, creating this environment, to the Lauder Institute and everyone involved. And of course, our thoughts are with Jim. Everybody said it, saying it again. I've known Jim for the past 5 years, met him at least twice a year in conferences, as well as keeping in touch. He was a big loss to us all. But one thing that I've always remembered that he emphasized when bringing together was the word partnership, collaboration, networking. If nothing happens in this setting, the networking over dinner, over lunch, it in itself is a real investment in our relationship and partnership, potential partnership. And this would have to continue. Now Jim started it, we should finish it. Partnership under COVID and post-COVID, I can sum it up in a few words. And I'll begin by saying partnership can either happen by nature through networking, natural overlap of interest, of targets, of objectives, of audience, or it has to happen by design. By design is a more difficult one, but it's a more lasting one, a better one, and more common one. And we really need to invest more in the design, because leaving things to nature, A, we drift apart, we occasionally remember each other, especially during conferences, and funding sources are not always obvious, but when you create the right partnership, you can go for the right funding, do the right research, and have the right impact, and through wider partnership, you have a much greater impact, both locally and globally, on your policymakers as well as the general community. Under COVID, we were really tested and we were pushed to the limit in terms of what we can do together or alone. We are so different, we are so diverse, no two people in this room can do each other's jobs. We are different in terms of our funding, of our structure, affiliation, and staffing, but importantly, we are different in our geographical location, in the countries we work in, and the system we engage, and so on. The toughest one would be if you're working in an environment where it's dysfunctional, the state is fragile, rule of law is a problem, and the government is not focused on listening to your logic or policy recommendations or even evidence-based policies and expect that you have an impact. Therefore, you need more than anywhere else in places like my country, you need partnership to make things happen, to create the right pressure, to lobby for change, for rule of law, good governance, and so on. If you live in a fully functional state, there is logic, there is media, there is civil society, there is parliament, there is so much, there is rule of law that you can even hold people to account in retrospect if they hadn't listened to your evidence-based recommendations. But in countries like my country, it is tough. Under COVID, we came under severe financial constraint, our staff movement and freedom, and what we found is that the global partners also were very well restricted. We had so many people coming in and out of Iraq, carrying out research, they no longer were able to, yet they had the grant, they had the funding, they had to spend it. We had several grants, one of them called Horizon 2020, to study prevention of violent extremism. It is a multi-centered one with a lot of European partners, and then we had to do the work. So we gradually learned this new trick of doing things virtually, over the phone, but actually we found that it is possible, it's quite fun. But importantly, our international partners became increasingly dependent on us. And as well as ourselves, in due course, we had to go through the rigor of making sure we still produce quality. Because you do lose quality when you lose that in-person interviews, data gathering, going around in the field. But we were able to do a lot of that. And now, some people have become so lazy, when you give them the option of face-to-face interviews, they still prefer the virtual one. But of course, technology got better as well as people getting better. I know you and I, our suits, maybe the jackets were still well worn out, but the trousers were pristine because you never needed to wear them that often. But that is the comfort of your own home. Our diversity is richness, is important, adds complementarity. What we need, however, is to think, what can we do to really collaborate? It's difficult to collaborate. But actually, coming from a university background, we know, first of all, many of the grants, the big grants that people tend to win, are multidisciplinary, okay, as well as multifaceted. No one individual institution or person can do them. And there are grant calls, or at least funding become available. They are designed to be addressed by many different people looking at the same picture from different angles. So what if we share information about grant calls, then go for joint grant application, joint funding, joint project, and then joint publication? And what a profile, what an impact. We can even have papers, not only policy reports, that go into high-impact publication lists. And that is track record. You build that with time, more and more collaborations will follow. This is actually COVID resistant. It can happen under COVID, it can happen after COVID. Here in this community, we need to carry on meeting, but in our future meeting, we should be sharing data.
Recording in progress.
Thank you. We could be sharing information on funding, on opportunities, on actually sometimes creating demand for our ideas. We have an idea, we want an impact, we want to influence change. We can come up with the idea that will influence funding, that will then make funding available and us winning it together. Our impact on policy and governance as well as communities much greater when we are together, but it's not obvious unless you think of bringing the minds together and creating those opportunities. So keeping the networking going, sharing information, there is no limit how much you can collaborate. The string of collaboration goes from being absolutely minimalistic in just providing information to all the way up to being fully integrated approach. I shall leave it for the question and answers.
Thank you very much. I think I might want to switch it up here a little bit. Try and see if Brian would like to come in at this point. Is he online?
I am indeed. Akshay, if you can hear me all right.
We can hear you, but we cannot see you. So.
Well, you're not missing anything, Akshay. You're not missing anything.
There you go. We can see you now.
Wonderful. It's great to see you all in that room. I really am filled with regret, Akshay, that I'm not able to join you. I'm another victim of COVID travel, unfortunately, but I'm so pleased to see you all there together. And I'm really pleased that we're having this particular conversation about partnerships. I think, in truth, as I reflect on your questions, Akshay, I think for our sector, partnerships with other even like-minded organizations has historically, I think, been anathema to our operations. And I think you alluded to it a little bit in your introduction. I think, regrettably, for much of our history, the industry has, because of how we generate revenue, we viewed each other more often as I think competitors rather than as partners. And this is obviously has come at great cost to the sector, certainly. But I think that it's all changing, and it's changing because it has to. It has to change, and I suspect we'll get into some of those reasons in the Q&A as well. I agree with what's been said thus far, but let me maybe try to frame this question of partnerships really to your first question, Akshay, in two different areas. One, looking at partnerships really not as a luxury, but as a necessity for our survival. Both to innovation as well as to the core business as well. And so with that, maybe I'd like to just sort of focus on those two issues, innovation and business, and how they both interact and interplay, and how partnerships can, I think, help support both. So why don't I start with the former? I think some of the best innovation that I have seen across many of your organizations, and certainly here at Stimson, has emerged from collaborations that really cut across multiple disciplines, across geographies. I will just reinforce what Delaware mentioned in his remarks. Our partnerships on the ground in region, those partnerships that cut across geographies really have been, I think, critical to much of the success that we have experienced here at Stimson. And maybe let me give you just one example from our own history. 10 years or so ago, Stimson was engaged in a project on illicit trafficking patterns in East Africa. We were looking for effective modes of reinforcing border security that could ultimately be scaled and replicated. It was a very typical think tank project, and although the center brought to the table what I think is global renown for the technicalities of border control, it was only through a local partnership with the Africa Peace Forum did we gain that essential ground truth, really an understanding of local dynamics that not only informed our research findings, but led us to ultimately operationalize those findings as a prototype around a rhino sanctuary in southern Kenya. This became a very atypical think tank activity. Our partnership with the forum led to the development of a public-private partnership with regional governments, with private tech companies, with communications firms, to build and ultimately scale an effective low-cost command control communication system that digitized the intelligence that was gathered by park rangers in the field. And for some time, it was one of the few sanctuaries in the region whose population was actually growing rather than receding in the face of poaching. Now, this project clearly would not have been possible without those partnerships. It began as a think tank to think tank partnership that ultimately scaled to the government level, to private industry, and a remarkable set of innovations that were just created and ultimately adopted and scaled well beyond the sanctuary. And I could tell similar stories outside of the think tank sector, where our partnerships with the global reinsurance sector has led to a targeted investment of public and private monies into climate resistant infrastructure. Our partners with hard science researchers whose collaboration have yielded new tools for customs agents to identify dangerous chemical precursors, or with more recently the blockchain industry creating new tools for regulators to track the movement of nuclear materials. So all of these successes, for us at least, have been generated not in isolation at Stimson, quite the opposite, but in partnership with others, and oftentimes really quite uncommon partnerships. I think that it's not just that increased innovation, however, that partnerships yield for Stimson. Coming to the second point, although we sit in Washington and in Brussels, our work is global, and it's very much hands-on, as the examples that I just gave suggested. It requires our staff to be present in Beijing and in Myanmar and in Vietnam and Bogota. But much, of course, has changed in the wake of COVID, as evidenced by my sitting here in Washington rather than there with all of you. And I think absent the local partnerships that we have built over the course of the past 30 years, the travel restrictions brought on by COVID would have clearly spelled an end to that work. Even as the COVID economy has been tough, I think, on our sector, Stimson has actually been able to grow through the pandemic. And there's little doubt in my mind that partnerships were a major factor in that, because I think it bred resilience into our business model. Even as we were not able to board planes and get on the ground, our local partners, to the earlier point, have been able to continue and carry water on our behalf, just as we have been able to do likewise for them. And so, Akshay, if I may just say in closing, I'd like to give a nod to the great Jim McGann as well, who did so much to help this think tank CEO generate so many of the successful intersectoral partnerships that Stimson has benefited from for many years. And I will leave it at that and look forward to the questions, sir.
Thank you, Brian. Your examples of your work on illicit trafficking in Africa and the global reinsurance market, I think, is very well taken. Perhaps I might come back and ask you a little bit more about that if we get a chance later on. Can I bring the conversation back to the panel here and ask Mr. Doran for your opening statement on partnerships and think tanks?
Sure. Let me just open by thanking the chairman of the board of Darasat, Sheikh Abdallah, for continuing this innovation of this operation. But also, I didn't know Jim McGann. I see references to him in this conference, and I think we had one Zoom meeting with him a week before coming here. And many times in life, you have those moments where you go, gee, I wish I had known this guy. But I hadn't, and I think he has helped enormously with the, I would say, deepen the conscious awareness of people of the importance of the bodies that we lead. Just as a matter of introduction, I have been in the position of being in and out of government for a number of years, sometimes serving in the government of the State of Israel, and sometimes outside it, but operating as the president of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. And that gives me a kind of unique perspective to see, so what do these think tanks do? Do they really help? Can they really do something the government can't do? And in those maybe 20 years or so, I learned the special advantages of think tanks and what they can contribute to our shared interest in seeing greater stability, greater understanding between states and peoples. And I firmly believe that think tanks can continue to make a difference. First of all, when you're in a think tank, as opposed to government, you don't require the approval of the political leadership when you are pursuing some new course of action. If it fails or leads to embarrassment, well, you're out of business. But if it doesn't, if it leads to a breakthrough, if it leads to some new understanding, you can bring that to your government contacts and they might adopt it. And for that reason, the think tanks have a kind of unique position they're in for this kind of work. On the other side of your contacts, let's say a government with whom you don't have diplomatic relations, your country doesn't have diplomatic relations, wants to sort of check out a potential contact with your side. Well, if it's a think tank, he's got deniability. Because as we know, there's an active journalistic world out there that is always trying to find out, did Israel actually talk to the Libyans? What happened there? So the deniability factor is also very important for allowing people, governments, all kinds of entities to have contact with one another without committing officially their country. We're sitting now in Bahrain. And Bahrain is a signatory to the Abraham Accords, one of the latest really revolutionary developments in Middle Eastern diplomacy. And I have to say, I tremendously appreciate the leadership of Bahrain in this area, and I want to congratulate them. But there are a number of countries in the Gulf and in the Middle East who haven't joined the Abraham Accords. Some of these countries actually have had some kind of diplomatic contact with Israel. We used to have an office in Muscat in Oman, but Oman hasn't joined the Abraham Accords. But let's say there are countries like that which hope to explore a new relationship with Israel, with a new set of understandings of how we should operate in the Middle East. They can reach out to us and to others through think tanks. And if the think tanks weren't there, they wouldn't pursue that option. So I believe that that's a very important feature that the think tank world brings to Middle Eastern diplomacy now, in the past, and in the future. I can tell you this, personally in 2015, we had contact with a research center in Jeddah. It was small, but it was the first of those kind of contacts. It wasn't official. And it was tremendous, it was of tremendous use to both sides. I'd like to say how today different parties are also communicating in the kind of new world that we have. One thing that the current situation with COVID has done, it's brought a boom to the industry of Zoom. And so you can understand that Zoom is one way of circumventing the whole issue of, oh, do I have to get my vaccine updated? But Zoom can also be a way of reaching out to populations where you don't have a way of having diplomatic contact. And one of my people in the Jerusalem Center brought us into dialogue with tribal leaders in Iraq and in Syria, even though no diplomatic relations. And we were able to talk, we were able to exchange ideas. They put proposals out, and I found it to be amazing. They spoke in Arabic, our people translated, and it was a very positive experience. We can always bring those experiences back to our political leaders if there's something to show, if there's something to share. And that's what we did in most cases. I also want to say one other thing about what this kind of contact can eventually do. One of the problems Israel frankly has is that while it has these great humanitarian instincts, it wants to reach out to its neighborhood. It wants to reach out to the peoples around it. It's many times blocked by the political realities that we have. And what I saw was, even in cases where we have diplomatic relations, let's take with South Africa. We found that many of the special technologies which we could bring to South Africa, which would improve the situation of water for the South African population, were simply blocked by the sensibilities of the ruling party there. We also found, and this is a period when even before I was in the Director General's seat of the Foreign Ministry and afterward, that you could reach out not only to the governments of certain countries, you can reach out to the populations. For example, I went to Johannesburg in 2016 and met with the chiefs of the main tribes of South Africa, like the Zulu tribe. And they were interested in obtaining Israeli water purification technology. So I think that the...
Excuse me, you have one.
Huh?
You have to wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay. So I think that, first of all, coming sometimes as an entity which is not an official government entity, and coming with our, what we have to offer the world is something which is helpful for Israel, it's helpful for our potential partners, and last but not least, I have to mention that our medical capacities in Israel have been steadily improving over the last few decades. so that when our diplomatic relations improved in West Africa, we helped bring the teams that dealt with the spread of Ebola in that area. So I think that, A, the state of Israel wants to be more active, more involved. Two, we have a problem of political warfare, which I don't want to get into, but it's there that has prevented that. And three, to the extent that think tanks can help lower the barriers between the state of Israel, its neighbors immediately contiguous to it, and its neighbors further away, it can bring about a new reality for many people and help us make a contribution.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the interruption. I just had to keep time. Marlo.
Yes,
over to you.
thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the Resat and TTCP for putting together in such hard times. I met Jim 12 years ago, and since there have been dozens, hundreds of summits, dinners, and lunches. As I said yesterday during our dinner, although he had that inexcusable habit of cutting the cigars in half, he was a man who could really understood the value for the minds to talk, for the minds to dialogue, exactly what we're trying to do here today. Well, think tanks can collaborate rather than just compete. I used to say it's easier said than done. Although partnerships can potentialize the work of think tanks, the sum of all the resources, intellectual technology, and even financial resources, they are not always a priority in the organization's strategy. Why so? Why so collaboration between think tanks so difficult? Well, in my region, in Latin America, the region I came from, most of the think tanks are small or medium organizations with limited budgets and resources, which means their focus tends to be on funded projects, money talks. And while this is important, it must be remembered that in Latin America, there is no such thing as donation culture, a culture widely established in the US and Europe. In other words, the funding sources for think tanks come primarily from international cooperation and products. The result, this creates an environment of competition for resources, financial and non-financial resources, that can contaminate all the relationships. So, not only partnerships are not always on the top of the agendas, but they can also be seen as a kind of distraction from what really matters. This difficulty limits the potential of the partners could have to generate mutual gains. Well, is it possible to surpass this obstacle? Definitely yes, but that takes a scarce resource, and this scarce resource is time. It takes time to build trust. Maybe that's why we don't see so many large partnerships between think tanks in Latin America, but we know we are always in a hurry. But I'd like to mention two examples of partnerships that, maybe one example of a partnership that is working quite well for some time. I would say 27 years. We have established in 1994 a survey called Latin American Economic Survey, which measures the expectation of economic agents regarding the future of the economy. Today, there are 23 think tanks in 19 countries for all Latin America. They collaborate generating information and also in the analysis of the data. Many economic agents use research to make decisions at a regional level. The project counts on the expertise of each partner in its own country, and autonomy is fully respected. Maybe that's why it works. Moreover, the autonomy is valued. This is just one example. I will stop here and leave the other points for the Q&A sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Stormy, can I invite you now to give your opening remarks on the questions of the panel?
Yes, thank you so very much. First of all, I want to thank the organizers. This conference couldn't have been more timely. And I'm one of those persons who haven't met Jim in person, and I really also very much wish I had so. This is, I think all of us being here is just so wonderful. We wouldn't have imagined that 1 year ago. And I can only underline, it is so much nicer than a Zoom conference to see everybody, to talk to everybody, and I think it's like a breath of fresh air. And I had to get that out, because Zoom conferences are good, but this is just something entirely different. When I started out as a young researcher, a young woman at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, SWP in Berlin, I got the responsibility for one international project which was called GIPSA, the dialogue between think tanks in Germany, India, Brazil, and South Africa. And one of our partners, Dipankar, is also here, and that was for me an eye-opener, I have to say. An eye-opener what you can achieve when you cooperate with each other. And it was not just a nice travel program for us to visit each other's countries and learn about each other's countries. We developed policy recommendations together on a consensual basis and presented those to our governments. And they had a lot more impact than if we would have done it by ourselves. And that for me was an eye-opener, and since then I've been a very strong supporter of international collaboration and cooperation. What I would like to do is first of all remind us why these international cooperation collaborations are so important, and secondly what think tanks can do, should do, and maybe could also do better. So let me come to my first point. We are facing a multitude of crises right now. You know all those, and we have talked about them, and we are experiencing them every single day. It's the climate crisis, it's the health crisis, and my country is just facing the fourth wave of the pandemic, but it's not just the pandemic, we are facing lots of other health risks as well we have to deal with. It's the third big crisis we are facing is a refugee crisis. The number of refugees has increased tremendously throughout the pandemic, and is still on the rise. The fourth crisis we are facing is an attack on our democracies within and from outside. The fifth crisis is are geopolitical risks and increasing tensions, and the sixth crisis, I would say, is a global governance crisis. The global governance fora and regimes being also under attack. Why am I listing all of these again? To underline that these are not individual crises which we can deal with individually, but they are interconnected, they are reinforcing each other, they are highly complex, and they are, so to say, systemic. And our policy responses, however, are often silo-oriented. And unfortunately, I see that also still in our think tank world. We are still staying too much within our disciplines, within countries and across countries. And that is something we need to change if we really want to build resilience. And what do I mean by resilience? I mean identifying crises early, recovering from crises, adapting to crises, but what is most important, that is transforming after a crisis. And we can only do so if we work more and better together. So let me come to my second point. What is our role as think tankers? Our job is to analyze, to interpret, to create knowledge, and also to identify risk, and as one of the panelists earlier on said, to also hold governments accountable for when something isn't working. Our job is also to transfer the knowledge. So if we create knowledge and it stays in our nice desk drawers, that's not going to help anybody. So we need to get it out there to different parts of the society, not just government, also the business community and also civil society organizations. We need to develop recommendations which are timely and targeted and have a transformative power. But what I also think is our job is to build community and understanding and trust. So these, I would say, are our five important jobs we have to do. And how do we do that best? By a vibrant and thriving think tank community, and I think we need big think tanks, small think tanks, so the big tankers, so to say, and the small speedboats. We need a vibrant exchange between researchers and think tanks. We need empirically sound research, as we heard in one of the earlier panels. Information is really gold, and empirically sound information is even better than gold. We need out-of-the-box thinking, and we really need to keep the channels open, also with the government, and also, I would say, the business community. But I want to add one thing which we haven't talked so much about before, and that is holding ourselves accountable to standards. We heard a lot about misinformations and social media and campaigns and how important media literacy is. I think we need to do that with ourselves as well. We also need to make sure that what we put out there is really factual and fact-checked and based. So we already heard that there are a lot of things which made it more difficult throughout the pandemic. And I would say, I mean, looking also inside my own my own institute, the Aspen Institute Germany, I mean, we all have funding problems. But that translates also to short-term contracts and to job insecurity for young researchers. And that is not always healthy. And that is something we need not just to talk about the institutions, we need not just to talk about the money and the funding, we need to talk about the individual researcher and what the environment means to that individual person. I would also say that it has become, as we heard earlier also on this panel, it has become a lot more difficult to collect empirical evidence, not just because of the lockdowns, but because also, coming back to the attack on democracies, it has become more dangerous for some researchers traveling to certain regions because they are telling uncomfortable truth. I would also say that at least throughout the pandemic, at least in my country, it was also harder to talk directly to the policymakers and really get your recommendations across. So there's, I mean, tons of research out there, but to really single out what needs to be implemented, I think that has not become easier for policymakers. So what can we do? A short 10-point plan. So first of all, we need to bundle our resources better. If we all try to do all the same, that's not going to work. So let's, as we heard earlier, let's form collaborations together, apply for funding together, and use our resources better. The second one I would say is we maybe could also be better in drawing up recommendations, doing it across borders together. And I'm thinking of the Think Tank 20, for example. And I have been the German Sherpa for the B20 in the past and the B7. If you want to give policy advice to international policymakers, it's more persuasive if it's been developed on a consensual basis and if a consortia from different countries or researchers from different countries are making the suggestions. I also would say that we can improve by being a little bit more targeted. We need to identify who we want to address with what we want to address them. That's my next point, my fourth point. We need to use existing channels for this a little better, also coming to the T20, but also maybe create new ones, thinking about other international organizations which don't have such an institutionalized exchange process. My fifth point is we need to think more out of the box. So what I would love for us to do, for example, here is next time we meet, do a scenario process about the think tanks of the future. How could they look like? A forecasting process, for example. How do we, best case, worst case? And how do we avoid the worst case? My sixth point is that we need to create learning platforms for young researchers, and we need to do so across borders, and also really assist young people. Maybe we can set up more exchange programs between think tanks for young researchers to experience what I experienced very early on in my career. And my very last point is coming back to holding ourselves accountable. Maybe it's also because we heard it several times, society, people are looking at think tanks for information, for interpretation, for facts. And maybe we need to set up something with what holds us accountable. Maybe we also need a global code of conduct for think tanks. And with this, I end.
Thank you very much. That's been a very rich set of opening remarks. I'm particularly taken by the different examples you've all given from your vantage points on what kind of partnerships have worked for you. Laura, you started by talking about topics, and multidisciplinary approaches is probably one way to do those partnerships. Brian, you spoke about how local access and specific expertise is what you were looking for and really worked in specific projects. Dora, you talked about track 2 and track 1.5 as the mechanisms by which think tanks can play their role. And track 2 and track 1.5 by definition requires a partnership, requires a think tank on the other side to come forward and collaborate. And then, of course, Marlo, you talked about sometimes maybe just an association or a large affiliation of think tanks, maybe just for information exchange is also valuable. At least there is knowledge about each other, and perhaps when they do get together, they're able to exchange notes. And Stormy, of course, you've spoken about many things, but what struck me was the importance of consensus, and that while you brought the example of the G20, that it would be a lot more effective if instead of that one think tank from Germany were to make that policy recommendation to the German policymaker on a global issue, as opposed to actually having 5 others or 7 others or 17 other think tanks trying to make the same recommendations. So I think the power of consensus. What remains now is then to identify what are those areas which naturally lend themselves to such kind of partnerships, and sometimes they don't, and sometimes we need to individually make progress where partnerships are not possible. Is there a situation where we need to be eagle-minded and just go specifically, or can we be like honeybees and work together towards a particular problem? But I want to draw you out on 1 or 2 other points that you all made. Maybe I'll switch up the order a little bit. Brian, if you're still with us, you are with us.
I am
right?
indeed, sir. I am indeed.
Brian, maybe, and this second round is probably a minute or 2 only. 1 or 2 minutes maximum is your response time. So Brian, let me start with you. I just want to switch up the order here. You spoke about the Global Reinsurance Project and illicit trafficking, local expertise. Did you find that the partnerships with institutions or experts outside of the think tank world, say business or regulators, is much more effective and more natural than partnering with other think tanks?
It's a great question. I mean, as I alluded to, actually at the outset, I think typically, we viewed one another as competitors, and it really is entirely because of the business, right? That we're competing for funding at the most basic level. So in that regard, yes, it's more difficult, right, to find those collaborations. And to the point that you made in terms of, how do we kind of foment these partnerships? It's clear to me that we can't force them, right? We're human. There is, I have yet to identify a way that, that these partnerships can be forced. They really have to emerge organically from think tank to think tank. In terms of partnerships beyond, I mean, again, it's I think a challenge to, identify ways to collaborate that promote innovation but don't negatively impact business. And so in that regard, I would say it certainly is, easier for us to identify partnerships with government, to identify partnerships with private sector actors. But on one level. On the other hand, though, it is also been clear to me in the most effective partnerships that we have found that it is, that those trusting relationships, simply because our mission spaces overlap more easily in the think tank space than they do with private sector actors, than they do with government, that we understand one another, we understand our respective models of engagement with think tanks more than we do with a private for-profit company. And so in that regard, I would say, the effect, the partnerships can be developed more naturally. But again, they cannot be forced. They really do have to be organic and based on mission at the end of the day.
Thank you. Maybe I want to come to you, Dilawar. You spoke about multidisciplinary approaches and probably trying to, maybe even applying for grants together. Would you say that COVID and climate change has actually forced us, I mean, these are issues which have forced us to look outside our own institutions, because the mandate, even for yourself, your mandate of your institution, you have such an important mandate, you have a heavy workload. Would you have considered looking outside if it wasn't for the pandemic, for instance?
I think we are clearly think tankers, reflected in the variation between them and the diversity. We are flexible. Many of us, like us, for example, at my institution, we think of ourselves as policy specialists, but not any particular field. Because after all, we are trying to influence the leaders and the public through evidence which direction they should go to and what kind of policies they adopt. It doesn't matter whether it's health, climate, education, security, you name it. At the end of the day, the grants that we apply for, the funding streams or sources we go for, it's all to do with policy. And where a new field comes about, we don't say, oh, we don't know anything about it. We hire the people who know about it. After all, it's the art and the science of being a think tanker, applying your tools into translating evidence at the micro level, at the specialist level, into policies that even a politician can understand, okay? Not only just the specialist. So essentially, when you think about this, it means there's no limit how much think tankers can actually do. The other point I want to be specific about, we tend not to sometimes think big. We tend to think that we're very local, we're very limited, we're very small, and so on. And especially in the Middle East, we tend to think very, very local and not think big. We wait for somebody in Europe or United States to come up with a big issue like climate, big question, and say, okay, let's address it in a big way. And they often initiate those network of collaborators across many countries and say, okay, we are coordinating it. And often they take 3/4 of the funding to their coordination, and then the people who do the work on the ground end up being the foot soldiers. We need to take that leadership ourselves to say it's not just one or two, because it's multidisciplinary. We should all be able to address big issues. We are very good at, all of us, good at engaging politicians often, policymakers, not necessarily very effective always, but we're good at understanding how we can grab their attention. But we need to engage each other as well. We engage the public and the politicians, but we've not engaged each other as a community to actually explore the best ways of maximizing efforts and getting the most of our limited funding. I mean, just as an example, Jim did a great job in bringing us together, otherwise we wouldn't have known each other. I didn't actually know that half of the people on this panel, their institution, I didn't know they existed. So that is a shortcoming we can address. For example, if we had a common newsletter that shares information, quality publication, events, funding sources, anything that would be of common interest, we begin to know each other so well, we know who to go to when there's a grant stream, a grant opportunity, or a big question, or climate change, so on. Climate change is such a fantastic topic that you can actually see it's impacting all of us. We in Iraq, it's impacting our lives, our security, our economy, our unrest and stability, as well as society. So imagine wanting to address that, yet we wait for President Biden to start an initiative to address global climate change, and then we look at it and say, where do we feature here? Are we going to be able to squeeze in and get some of that funding? No, we should be taking the other way, and there are funding for that sort of thinking if you think right and if you think big. The other thing we are very good at, think tankers, is actually meetings, events, conferences. We tend not to go to each other to get to know each other. I don't know how many think tankers exist, not only in MENA countries, but in Iraq itself. So we need to engage each other more effectively with that in mind, impact in mind, with output in mind, with at least the investing in our future by knowing each other more often. So accepting our diversity and overlap being limited, but actually forging collaboration, not having high expectations, and always be prepared to surprise yourself how much you can achieve. So effectively, if we can set up, I think there are some efforts or some thinking at the moment ongoing between colleagues. Imagine if we have regional think tanks and we have global think tanks. If we had a mechanism by which we can stay in touch and be more effective and keep it going, sustain it. At MENA region, for example, we really need to create our own MENA leadership, MENA coordination, MENA awareness, and then be more communicative and share information with that same spirit, accepting our diversity. I don't call it differences. They are not differences, they're diversity. Accepting it, accepting our limitations, but also exploring what can be done together to maximum benefit.
Thank you very much. Very good answer, but I'm just hurt that you did not know about my think tank. But
I'm being honest. You didn't know about mine, did you? I would be very flattered if you knew about mine.
Your point is very well taken, and I think part of the reason of attending these meetings is not just to be able to coordinate how we disseminate each other's work, but also get to know about each other's work to begin with. Stormy, I know of the contributions you have made to think tanks as well as business chamber, because you were B20 Sherpa, you were with the business chamber in Germany, and you've been with think tanks, so you have a dual hat, so to say, or at least that kind of experience. Are we in line with the kind of collaboration governments and businesses are doing? I often feel like we are a step behind in that kind of international cooperation. So sometimes think tanks actually end up in meetings or with policy views which are actually less informed than what governments are doing or what businesses are doing to begin with. But I'd like your view on this.
Indeed, I switched sides several times in the last 7 years.
Just hold on one second.
Try again. No.
It's okay, we can hear you. It's all right.
Maybe it's the business chambers that are just cut you off. Oh, okay. It's still not working? Okay. So maybe I'll come back to you, Stormy. Marlo, why don't we come to you? You've spoken a little bit about the associations that you have done. So perhaps tell us, because you were talking about like that association, and you've talked about how you have tried to internationalize the universities and the academic collaborations. So maybe what has worked there and what did not work? Oh, it's not working either. Is it just my mic that's working? I'm really flattered that you think that you want to listen to me, but we're.
Maybe we can ask questions.
Yeah, I know we need to. Mr. Torre, is it working for you? The mic? Can you?
Testing 1, 2, 3.
Yes, it's working. All right. So maybe we start. We go with you, sir. Tell us a little bit about your experience with advice that you get when you were in government, because you were in government and think tank, but when you're in government, you're getting advice from business and think tanks both. And where have you found the think tanks to do really well in the kind of advice that they give versus, say, others, say, business or other interest groups that come your way?
Well, I don't know about business and interest groups. I just have seen that if, in a changing world, you need new ideas in order to address the challenges you face at a given time. And the new ideas can run up against conventional wisdom in your own country or in the neighboring countries. It becomes hard to implement it. But if a think tank puts forward the idea, it can, of course, suggest a course of action that would make the idea more acceptable. I'm speaking very abstractly, so it's very unsatisfactory because I can't disclose a lot of things, but I firmly believe that think tanks are an important vehicle for getting new thoughts out there. I mean, one of the big things that happened, this is not related so much to the whole COVID crisis, you know, Israel has become a regional hub, and I mentioned it before, in the medical field. If you go to Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, go to Ichilov Hospital in Tel Aviv, Rambam in Haifa, you'll see patients there from all over the Arab world. You'll also see doctors that are Jews and are Palestinian Arabs, and you know, it's not the Middle East that you're seeing on CNN. Or when Israel developed a kind of military clinic on the Golan Heights, which serviced the Sunni population in Syria that had been affected by the Syrian civil war. So I think that role, we have a huge medical infrastructure. It has only grown in recent years. That has to be built up, exploited in a way that will help the region. And I think Israel is prepared for that, and Israelis are prepared for that. Why would Israeli doctors run, as I said before, to West Africa to deal with Ebola unless it was in their sensibility, unless it was part of their idealism to try and help the world in those areas? So I think that has to be built up, and I think the benefits for, first of all, the Middle East region, and then for regions that are around us could be enormous.
Is your mic working now?
I think it is.
Okay. So you want me to repeat the question to you?
No, I think I do remember. First of all, I wanted to share the experience in a couple of projects which we initiated, which picks up on some of the points which have been said, and that is the exchange between think tanks also within our own countries. What we created this year, a colleague of mine from SWP and I, is something which we called Director's Cut, where the president's directors of the think tanks meet with each other on a regular basis to talk about the challenges. And in the beginning, it was kind of stiff, but the more and more we do it, the more we exchange really what we are worried about, because it doesn't make sense to make the same mistake 3, 4, 5 times, but to learn from each other. But then we have to overcome this competition thinking, and also lay open our vulnerabilities and what we know we are doing well and maybe not so well. I can really recommend that. It's sometimes a little bit of a painful experience, but it really, really helps. The second what I wanted to exchange or to talk about is that the channel relationship between business, think tanks, and governments. I think we need to increase our knowledge and understanding in all directions, how we work and how we think and what our cultures are. And we cannot do so by just writing wonderfully empirically based papers and handing over a paper. So we made really good experiences with, for example, role plays, where we invited think tankers, government representatives, and business representatives to play through a global challenge, and then see what can be learned from each other in that process. For example, we simulated the EU-China summit. And big learning experience, I think, for everybody. We didn't create any new empirically founded knowledge, right? But the understanding we created, that was really immense. And we also did something dissimilar from this, but with the same effect. And there was a scenario workshop on the future of Europe, where we also brought together different groups and works through different future scenarios. So I really think this is a great way to build relationships, also of trust and understanding, so that we do have a channel through which to communicate our findings better, our recommendations better. And last point I wanted to share is actually from the Business 20 and the Think Tank 20. As you mentioned, Akshay, I was responsible for the German B20 process under the German G20 presidency. And one of the big differences between B20 and T20 is the degree in organization, I would say. So very similar, both have the working group, the streams, on very similar topics. Big difference, however, is in the Business 20, there is one recommendation paper coming out of each stream, and this is where then the power is placed behind. In the think tank, there are about 15, 20 papers coming out of each individual working stream. Wonderful papers, but I'm not so sure how many will read them outside our own community. And there is not as much, I would say, behind the individual or the consensual recommendation. And I think if we were trying to consolidate a little bit what we are finding and putting this out there with a little bit more forcefulness behind this, joining together, I think we might increase our impact.
Okay, thank you. Marlo, we want to move to the Q&A, but I want to give you the last word here. Maybe perhaps something short and quick on...
Sure. Thank you for your question. Yes, I think the academic world has a lot to do with the think tank world. Of course, we can always hire the right people for the right place, but even in larger organization, and the organization I work for is not a small one, the importance of the alliances is huge. Your question was, does it work? Well, it depends on how asymmetric the relationship is, and how we can manage this asymmetry. I can give you an example, a very simple example. In 2012, we started a digital, what we call Democracy Digital Room. It's an initiative between 9 think tanks. And it didn't work for 2 years until someone from Colombia said, okay, listen, I'm going to pay for everything. And suddenly the others say, oh, are you? So that's fine, I'm going to pay too. And now we are talking about 7 countries since 1912, and it works. But it depends on how we manage the asymmetry.
Thank you so much. With that, we'll open up to Q&A. My takeaways are Brian's talking about collaboration should be organic. Dilawar talking about let's take the big ideas forward. Dore talking about that we still need independent, genuine ideas for the future. Stormy talking about scenarios and simulations. And Marlo talking about taking initiative. So with that, let me look at the room. Yes, the lady right there. Please go ahead.
Hello, thank you. It was really interesting to listen to this panel on partnerships because that was actually one of the main topics we discussed already last year during the fabulous town hall meeting initiative which Jim started at the onset of the pandemic. And Paolo Magri and I, we were co-chairs of the working group which was exploring how think tanks should adapt and change in the wake of the crisis. And the topic of partnerships was a reoccurring topic. So I invite everybody here who maybe was not involved in that process at the time to check out the website of TTCSP and download the Working Group 5 report, which actually contains some very interesting examples of partnerships and ideas and proposals for partnerships, not only between think tanks, but also think tanks with civil society organizations, with the business sector, etc., etc. So we discussed all different sorts and forms of partnership. I'm very happy to have heard the intervention from Ms. Stormy. Our institutions actually have collaborated for quite a while now, and Aspen Institute Germany is, I think, our biggest and most important think tank partner in Germany. Actually, I think that is a very good form and a very good example of a partnership which has been around for quite a few years, and where I think we have already made quite a significant impact through our collaboration, because we had, I mean, for us as think tankers from the Western Balkans, from all 6 countries in the Western Balkans, the fact that we had an institutional partner in Germany that offered us and provided us with a platform for discussions with German policymakers and advocacy efforts was extremely useful. My only concern is what happens when Aspen Institute Germany loses its funding for this specific project. And that is one really, really pertinent issue, because some amazing initiatives and very fruitful initiatives come to an end when project funding ends. And when they're project-based, that kind of makes them, it gives them an expiry date. So how can we overcome this, and what should we do in advance and on time to make sure that these kinds of, really proven and high-quality initiatives and partnerships, that they don't die out the moment a project ends? Thank you.
Maybe we take, would it be okay if we took one or two other, that one I think, Stormy, you can start with when we get to the answers, but that's one. Yes, sir.
As I was listening, as I was listening to Delaware, and you talked about regional areas of focus and concentration to create more dialogue amongst regional think tanks, we obviously have various regional summits through the TTCSP program. But then as we think about what Stormy talked about in terms of a code of conduct, which has come up repeatedly, what seems to me is that there is a risk for having a kind of fragmentation if there's not some coordinating agency to provide some guidelines and structure for those regional deep dives, if you will, to bring the various think tanks within those respective regions together. So what advice would you suggest to avoid fragmentation, meaning one region having a different code of conduct based on geopolitical, cultural, social, economic interests that would avoid the fragmentation of the program itself and the think tank community from a global perspective?
Thank you, sir. Anybody else? Okay, maybe Stormy, why don't you start with that, and the others are also welcome to add your answers. Go ahead, Stormy.
Thank you so much for mentioning that project. It's one of my favorite ones, and you are so right. I mean, actually, it does keep me awake at night right now, because we do face huge funding problems, and it becomes really problematic, because as soon as you set up a really, really good and well-working program which is funded by a foundation, or also maybe by the government in part, as this project is, if the foundation decides that it wants to discontinue the project, you will not find another foundation picking it up, because it's so branded with that one foundation. So it becomes we have it over and over at Aspen, Germany, that problem. We have a really great project, then the funding ends, and then we don't find any continuous funding for it. And I really don't have an easy solution for it, apart from how we try to work around it, is by rebranding and reframing, trying to bring the project to a different level, giving it a little bit of a different perspective, and then trying to continue with it. And that's something we are trying to do with this project as well. But you are absolutely right. It's a huge challenge, and I'm probably right that many of you are facing the same issue. And if you're more funded by the government, and in part we are, then if you are running, I mean, we are facing a huge problem right now with not having a functioning government yet, not having a functioning budget. And so if the foundation is gone, if the government money doesn't come, if you have limited resources from companies, that model becomes very, very difficult very quickly.
And I think embedded in her question was also this insight that with collaborations and partnerships, also you have to share risks of the program getting discontinued. So, so your partner may have ended up hiring resources, investing in capacity building, even promising to their policymakers or their ecosystem that a certain paper or a project is underway, and therefore there's risks to be shared on both sides, which comes along with
and responsibility. I mean, there's huge responsibility as well. So we are now looking into EU institutions and looking at partnerships to apply for new grants. But it's I think it's throughout doing a project, you really need to start thinking from the beginning on what if, and trying to answer the if earlier on. And not just at the end of the project thinking, oh dear, what are we going to do next?
Marley, you want to answer?
Yes. I just want to testify. My organization was founded as a government think tank 76 years ago. And 30 years ago, a new president stepped in, and he turned to us and said, okay, thank you very much for your collaboration, but you have no budget anymore. At that time, 30 years ago, we had 2,000 people working for us. We had to fire 700 people, and go to the market. So maybe talking about the future of the think tank, as Aaron said in the other panel, the change of the model, the business model of the think tanks, we passed through that 30 years ago, and we're still alive. Now we actually are bigger than we were 30 years ago. It involves a lot of changing the way we think, the product and everything, but it's possible, just testable.
Brian, do you have anything to add on this question?
Yeah, it's a really important question that has been raised from the floor. I mean, for us, and I suspect for everyone, we all struggle with this question. And I think the key really is diversifying our funding. I mean, for us, it's not just good governance; it's good business to have multiple funders for a single project. And so, the kind of the vicissitudes of the marketplace and the particular donors that may be fickle and jump in and out of particular themes or projects with their investments. We make ourselves, I think, resilient. And in many ways, I mean, this is the right panel to be having this conversation, because I think partnerships really are key to that diversification. Our donors or our partners, rather, in country and foreign countries are attracting a very different subset of contributions than we are here in Washington or in Brussels. And so, those partnerships in some ways kind of reinforce that business resilience, so that when one particular donor may, pull back or recede, others are already in place to support our work.
Very good point about business resilience. Clearly, obviously, even in business, corporations and firms face this all the time, and this is the kind of continuity planning is embedded in any corporate thinking. So I suppose that's something that we should incorporate. Did you want to add? Can I move to the second question? Did you? Okay. So second question.
Well, the second question, if I can start from this, the best way I would think answering is that we as a community, or what you say think tank, which is a very loose term, is not really an institutionalized set of highly structured organizations that you can, like universities, you can name them under one, and then each government, each institution would design their code of conduct and then how they should and introduce measures on their output, quality measures, ranking, and so on. So you cannot really compare any of those. What I see is a pool of organizations, ranging from being some of them one-man show, tiny, very sort of loose, all the way to government, it's like embedded in the Foreign Office, embedded in a university, embedded any other. So you can see how rigid or how flexible they can be. But as a whole, we call them think tanks because they tend to have that notional thing in common, that they all deal with policy or they deal with evidence-based recommendations, or there may be a minimum definition. So we really cannot apply the same rigidity as in universities on think tanks. We cannot judge any two think tanks by the same standards. So the best thing when it comes to sustainability, when we talk about sustainability, again, we cannot do anything about it. When the pool moves forward in time, maybe individual organizations, maybe large numbers at any one time will drop out, new ones created, and so on. So the pool will continue. They look as big as ever, but they actually they change in terms of the membership and component and the types and so on all the time. We cannot really go back and impose a structure or institutionalize something at the global level. Most of us are registered as NGOs, and we abide by the law of the land that is applied to NGOs, and others to government, and our accountabilities are to the law of the land. So what I would, however, say in terms of code of conduct, we need to be careful and not to put them in the same kind of categories. When it comes to ranking, this is a very important area that is affecting everyone's what do you call branding or marketing, as well as ego. I would say it has a lot. This ranking system is so important, it's so critical and so sensitive and complex. This is one that needs criteria. This is one that needs code of conduct, as well as measures how, criteria how to measure success. So if I understood the question right, is that really there is nothing we can do about sustainability other than leaving the pool to carry on, evolve its own way, and we cannot apply the same rule on all.
Anybody else have a response to that? Okay, are there any other questions? Yes, Aaron, go ahead.
Thank you, Akshay. I wasn't going to ask a question, but then I realized, Akshay, you and I had a 3-year partnership together. I remember saying to Marlos before the pandemic, let's work on something cool together. And he's like, yeah, and it didn't even matter what it was. We just wanted to work together. And Brian, we were talking about doing some stuff at the UN together. So my question is this, we've got this network built, but a lot of it's personality driven and relationship driven. So do you see any way to make it more institutional so that it survives changes in leadership, or are we bound to kind of live in this world where it's based on the strength of relationships that people have?
I'm probably being handed a note to shut this down. Okay, thank you. Who's that directed to? Sorry, Aaron?
Brian.
Anybody want? Marlo or? Well, let me start because you mentioned my name and that partnership that we were engaged in for 3 years. I think what worked really well is that we knew it was a track 1.5 dialogue or a track 2 dialogue, and that we had a certain responsibility that we could talk and talk about issues that the government was not talking about. It is something that was mentioned here in the panel as well. 2, that it was a partnership of equals. Each side brought their resources, brought their experts, and jointly discussed the ideas and collectively disseminated the ideas to the policymakers on each side. And number 3, I think it created a history, a documentation, a body of work, which for 3 years, that partnership with 10 papers remains in the public domain for students and the public and government officials to refer to. And I think that's what really worked. And
Can I make a comment, please?
Yes, please.
something has sort of become very clear to me in the course of this discussion, and that is, you know, there's a whole industry out there. There's the think tanks. I served as Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, so there's the UN world. But the greatest progress, particularly in the areas of international peace and security, which might not be what everybody's interested in here, the greatest progress was made, well, we used to say this, the sons of the region, when they took it upon themselves to study, make suggestions, and speak to their national leaderships about the suggestions they were putting forward. That really made a pivotal change. And you have to be very careful that you don't just create this like endless machine of recommendations that may not change people's lives very much. But I think when we, the people of the Middle East, do this and take responsibility for all facets of our international intercourse, I think that we can alter our region.
Okay. I think with that note, I'm sorry, I know Stormy and you both had something to add, and probably Brian does as well, but I have been given a note, and we know that we have to run on schedule. So with that, all that's left for me to do is thank the panelists who are here on stage, and Brian who's here online, for your thoughts and insights on this discussion. And with that, I'll hand it back to the... Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Please join me, ladies and gentlemen, in giving the panelists a very big hand. Akshay Mathur, Dilawar Alauddin, Brian Finlay, Dor Gold, Marlos Lima, Stormy Anika Maldner. Thank you very much for your contribution.